She was 20 and evicted. No family left to take her in, no roof of her own, just a small bone-handled clay-trimming rib worn smooth by 4 generations of women's hands, a single thumbed page from her mammy's kiln book sewn into the lining of her coat pocket, and 6 single-dollar bills she had earned scrubbing floors at a small Mennonite bakery in Ephrata. And with that $6, she bought a collapsing redware pottery barn built into the side of a stone-fenced field 2 miles up Hammer Creek Road in the small Pennsylvania Dutch settlement of Schaefer's Lane in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in a stretch of the Lebanon Valley that had not heard the slow turning of a kickwheel under lantern light since the winter of 1964. The dark-stained vertical pine siding had begun to split along the sills. The squat brick wood-fired bottle kiln out the back had cracked at the crown. But what nobody knew, least of all Hannelore Schaefer herself, was that glazed under the lead-free ash slip of dozens of unfinished crocks still standing on the cedar-drying shelves inside that barn in slow, patient dark for 178 years, was something her mommy and her mammy's mammy had pressed there across generations that would change her life forever. Before we go on, if you love stories like these, take a moment and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. We love to see how far these stories travel. She had seen the barn on a hand-printed card thumbtacked to the wooden bulletin board outside the Lancaster County feed mill in Leaditz in soft pencil. Redware pottery barn, half-acre, brick kiln, field frontage, $6 or best offer. See Mr. Eldred Mountjoy at the county courthouse. She had $9.20 folded in the inside pocket of her flannel workshirt. She walked the mile down to the small Lancaster County courthouse on a cold Tuesday morning in early February, with the snow lying thin and crusted over the brown fields, and she asked the woman at the front desk for Mr. Eldred Mountjoy by name. Mr. Eldred Mountjoy was 83 years old and had been the deputy clerk of Lancaster County for 56 of those years. He looked up at her over the long oak counter when she said her name, looked at her over the top of his bifocals, and went very still. "Schaefer," he said slowly. "The valley and the word. From Schaefer's Lane. You'd be Hildegard's granddaughter then." Hannelore nodded once. He folded his bifocals and walked back into a small storeroom without another word. He came back 2 minutes later with a heavy hand-forged iron key on a piece of plain hemp twine, the iron warm from being held in a drawer for a long time. $6, he said. "We have been keeping this key 60 years. Your mammy left it with my father back in 1964, and she told him plain, hand this to whichever Schaefer girl walks back up Hammer Creek asking after the Crocks. We had begun to wonder if any of you would." He laid the key in her palm. She paid him 6 soft paper dollars, signed her name, and he walked her to the door and set his old hand for 1 second on her shoulder. And he said very softly, "You go on up there before dark, hon. The barn has been waiting on you a long while." She had grown up with the smell of wet clay and wood smoke, with the cool, damp earth smell of fresh red Lancaster clay being wedged on a wooden table, with the warm, sharp smell of oak and hickory cordwood burning long in the bottle kiln, with the dry, chalky smell of ash slip glaze settling in clay jars on a cellar shelf, with the soft mineral smell of slip-trailed lines, drawn from a goosequill bottle across a leather-hard plate, with the deep autumn smell of cider and apple butter being slow-cooked in glazed redware crocks on the back porch of her mammy's small stone farmhouse. She had grown up sitting on a low cedar stool beside her mammy's wooden kickwheel when she was 3 and 4 years old, watching her mammy's long red-stained hands pull a tall 4-gallon storage crock up out of a single ball of wedged red clay with a slow patience that did not look like work, but like raising. Her mommy was Hildegard Schaefer, born in 1941 in the same small stone farmhouse at the head of Hammer Creek where Hannelore would later be born. She had learned the wheel and the kiln at the side of her own mother on the same wooden kickwheel and the same hand-built brick bottle kiln her great-grandmother had built in 1846. Hildegard was small and quick, with the long, red-stained fingers of a woman who pulled clay every day of her working life, her gray hair worn in a single tight bun pinned at the back of her neck under a small white Mennonite cap. Hannelore's mother, Elsbeth, had left the lane for Philadelphia when Hannelore was 3 and had not come back, and Hannelore's father, Reinhard, had died of a winter lung fever when she was 9, so the years had belonged to Mommy from the time Hannelore could walk a stone-fenced lane without stumbling. She learned to wedge a ball of red Lancaster clay clean of air before she could read. By 6, she could trim a leather-hard bowl with the bone-handled clay trimming rib without leaving a single mark. By 8, she could pull a 1-gallon redware storage crock straight and true up out of a ball of clay on the kickwheel. By 10, she could mix a clean lead-free ash slip glaze from hardwood ash, kaolin, and Lancaster red iron oxide clay in the exact proportions Mommy had taught her: 3 parts ash, 2 parts kaolin, 1 part red oxide. By 12, she could read a glazed pot. By 18, she had glazed and fired 411 pieces of redware in her own hand, and learned every one of the 17 lead-free ash and clay glaze formulas Mammy said a Schaefer woman had to know before she was allowed to sign her name on the bottom of a crock. Before Hannelore or Hildegard, there had been Margaret. Margaret Schaefer had come down off a ship at the port of Philadelphia in the autumn of 1822, 22 years old, with her young husband Johann, an ox cart, a small wooden chest of personal goods, and a single oiled leather pouch holding her great-grandmother's handwritten redware recipe book, and a small cedar box of dried hardwood ash glaze samples she had carried out of a small Palatinate village in the Rhineland that summer. The Schaefers had walked their ox cart west, up the Conestoga wagon road into the Lebanon Valley in the winter of 1822, and they had stopped at a small spring-fed branch in northern Lancaster County, because the bottomland along the branch held a deep bank of red iron oxide clay, almost identical to the clay her grandmother had pulled out of a bank above the Rhine. Margaret had knelt at the bank and pressed a thumb into the cold clay, and she had said, in the slow, careful German English she was still learning, "Here. We will not go further. We will dig here." She and Johann built a small, dark-stained pine-board barn at the head of the branch through the spring of 1823, and Margaret laid the first courses of the brick bottle kiln behind the barn herself, with hand-formed bricks made from the same red Lancaster clay through the summer of 1823, and she fired her first crocks in the kiln in the autumn of 1824. She kept the barn and the kiln for 46 years. She trained her daughter Elizabetha at her side, and Elizabetha trained her daughter Anna, and Anna trained her daughter Hildegard, and the redware pottery at Schaefer's Lane ran without a single empty kiln season for 142 years, until the winter of 1964, when Hildegard was 23, and her own mother Anna had just gone, and Hildegard closed the heavy dark pine door of the pottery barn on a cold December evening, and walked back down to the small stone farmhouse and did not open the barn again for 60 years. Mommy had 3 rules for the clay. The first was this: the clay knows. You do not throw the pot, child. You raise the pot up out of the clay with the slow, careful patience the clay is asking of you, and you do not argue with the clay. A potter who thinks she decides the shape is a potter who will lose 3 crocks out of every 5 in the kiln. The second was this: the kiln is the third hand. The first hand is yours, and the second hand is the clay's, and the third hand is the kiln's, and the third hand does more of the work than you and the clay combined. Mind the kiln, Hannelore, more than you mind the wheel. The third was this: we do not put lead in our glaze. A Schaefer woman has never put lead in a glaze in 4 generations, because we make crocks for sauerkraut and apple butter, and milk and cider, and the food a Pennsylvania Dutch family eats every day. And a lead glaze leaches into the food and slow poisons a child across a winter. The lead-free ash slip glaze your great-great-grandmother brought out of the Palatinate is what we use. It is harder to fire. It crawls in the kiln if you cool too fast, but it is the only glaze a Schaefer woman will ever lay on a crock that is going to hold food in a Pennsylvania Dutch kitchen. Mammy died in November of 2023, in her sleep, in her chair beside the wood-fired cook-stove in the small stone farmhouse on Schaefer's Lane, with the open-thumbed kiln book in her lap and a small bone-handled clay-trimming rib on the side table beside her. The doctor said it was her heart. Hannelore was 19. She did not cry. She came home from her shift at the Mennonite bakery in Ephrata and found Mommy in the chair, and she sat down on the floor beside the chair and laid her cheek against Mommy's cool hand, and she stayed there until the funeral home came. She finished trimming the last leather-hard bowl Mammy had been working on herself that night in her own careful young hand, the bone-handled clay-trimming rib moving slow and even across the foot of the bowl. And only when the bowl was finished did she sit down beside the cold cook-stove and finally let herself cry. The small stone farmhouse at the head of Hammer Creek belonged to the bank because Mommy had taken a small second mortgage on it during her last sickness. And within 4 months of Mommy's funeral, the bank had come and asked Hannelore to be out by the 1st of February. She had left with the small bone-handled clay-trimming rib Mommy had pressed into her hand on her last clear afternoon, a single thumbed page torn carefully from Mommy's kiln book sewn into the lining of her coat pocket, a small canvas bag of her clothes, and the photograph of 3 women standing in the open door of the Pottery barn in 1948. If these stories are reaching you tonight, take a second to subscribe. It truly does help us keep making them. And tell us in the comments, was there ever a small old craft in your family that someone tended in the dark for years on end? A kiln, a loom, a smokehouse that you carry with you from a woman who is no longer here. The 2-mile walk up Hammer Creek Road from where the borrowed pickup would no longer make the snow-rutted lane was longer than she remembered, because the snow had crusted hard along the stone fences and the wind off the brown February fields cut clean. The sycamores along the creek were bare and white-trunked against the low gray sky. The branch came down dark and clear over rounded fieldstones along the right. She found the foundation of the small stone farmhouse first, 4 courses of fieldstone in a square of new snow where the front porch had been, and just beyond the foundation, set into the south-facing slope of a stone-fenced field, the long, dark form of the redware pottery barn. 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, 20 feet tall at the peak of its dark-stained vertical pine-board siding, the boards silvered and split at the sills. A heavy, dark pine plank door at the south end, warped on hand-forged iron strap hinges, rusted dark, and just behind the barn, against the slope, the squat brick bottle kiln, 8 feet across at the base, 15 feet tall, the crown cracked along one side. 60 winters of fallen sycamore leaves and crusted snow banked deep against the threshold of the barn door. She did not cry. She brushed the snow and the leaves away from the threshold with her boot, fitted the heavy hand-forged iron key into the rusted iron lock, worked the key gently for the better part of 2 minutes until the wards remembered how to turn, and then the bolt slid back with a small dry sound, and the heavy dark pine plank door eased open on its hand-forged iron strap hinges with the slow groan of a door that had held shut for 60 winters. The cool, dry breath of the pottery barn came out to meet her, the dim, warm earth and ash smell of red clay and oak ash glaze and old kiln smoke, and the faint, sharp ghost of hardwood cordwood. She stood in the doorway a long minute. Then she lit her Mammy's small brass kerosene lantern, and she stepped inside. The barn was 40 feet of slow, dim, red-brown air. A heavy wooden kickwheel sat in the middle of the floor, the cypress pedal worn smooth at the foot, the redwood throwing head silvered with old clay. Along the south wall and the east wall and the west wall, long cedar drying shelves built into the dark pine siding by Margaret in 1823 and Elizabetha in 1835, rose 4 shelves high, the cedar gone dark, amber with age but uncracked. And on the cedar shelves, in long, quiet rows in the dim lantern, amber, stood the Crocks. Dozens of them. Some squat 1-gallon redware storage Crocks, some tall 4-gallon sauerkraut Crocks, some small pint jars, some shallow pie plates, some slip-trailed plates with goosequill loops of cream slip-drawn across the red. All of them unfinished, all of them glazed but unfired, the deep red of the clay just visible under the thin pale chalk white of the lead-free ash slip, waiting for the kiln firing that had not come in 60 years. She walked slowly down the center of the barn, the lantern held up, and she touched a single tall 4-gallon crock with her free hand. The dry slip moved against her fingertips with the soft chalk whisper of an ash glaze that had been sitting in the cool, dry dark for 60 years, perfectly preserved. Then she remembered very clearly a thing Mommy had said one Sunday afternoon over coffee at the kitchen table on Schaefer's Lane when Hannelore was 16. The good Schaefer Crocks, child. The ones we never fire in the kiln. We press what is dearest into the slip itself, child, between the second coat and the third coat of the ash glaze, and we let the slip dry slow over the paper, and the paper goes into the clay forever, because no thief who has never glazed a crock would think to scrape the ash glaze off a leather-hard pot and look for what a Schaefer woman has hidden there. Hannelore walked slowly to the very back of the barn, where the east cedar shelves ended against the north wall, and she set the small brass kerosene lantern on a small hand-hewn pine throwing table she had not yet noticed in the shadow of the back wall. She lifted down the first tall 4-gallon sauerkraut crock from the lowest shelf, the crock heavier than she had expected, the ash slip glaze cool and dry under her hands. She set the crock on the throwing table. She drew the small bone-handled clay trimming rib that had been Mammy's from her coat pocket, and she gently scraped the chalk-pale ash slip away from a small patch on the shoulder of the crock, and the slip came up in a soft, dry curl, and beneath the slip, pressed flat against the leather-hard red clay and sealed there by the second coat of glaze, lay a small piece of folded cotton paper. She lifted it carefully. A small folded square of cream cotton paper 3 inches by 4, the paper softened but uncreased, the ink faded but still readable. A single line in her great-great-great-grandmother Margaret's hand, in careful old Palatinate German script, dated October the 14th, 1826. Granddaughter, the line read, the lead-free ash slip recipe is 3 parts hardwood ash to 2 parts kaolin to 1 part red oxide. Mind the kiln. Margaret, she did not move for a long time. Then she lifted down the next crock, and the next, and the next. Glazed under the ash slip of 43 different crocks on the cedar drying shelves of the Schaefer's Lane Pottery barn, she found, that long February afternoon, 87 small folded squares of cream cotton paper, each one pressed flat against the leather-hard red clay and sealed there by a second coat of lead-free ash slip glaze, each one in the careful old hand of one of 4 generations of Schaefer women, each one carrying a single recipe, a single instruction, a single warning. The full recipe for the lead-free ash slip glaze, the temperatures of every cone in the brick kiln by hour through a 14-hour firing, the pattern of slip-trailed goose quill loops for a wedding plate, the recipe for a clean iron glaze brown that did not require lead, the recipe for a deep manganese purple slip Margaret had carried out of the Palatinate that no other potter in Lancaster County had ever known, the whole lead-free redware tradition of 4 generations of women pressed into the clay itself, sealed under glaze for 202 years. On the small hand-hewn pine throwing table at the back of the barn, on top of where Margaret had been working when she set down her clay trimming rib for the last time, lay a small flat tin box with a hinged lid and a small canvas sack. Hannelore lifted the tin first. Inside was the original kiln book, thick, sewn together with linen thread, the cover of soft-tanned cowhide, the pages of cotton paper hand-cut and hand-ruled, and on every page, in the careful old hands of 4 generations of Schaefer women, was the whole record of the kiln. Page after page after page, 202 years of careful firing observation. Inside the canvas sack lay 19 small American gold coins, $5 pieces from the 1860s and 70s. The gold Margarete and Elisabetha and Anna had set aside 1 coin at a time across 46 years and never spent. And folded into the back of the kiln book, sealed with a drop of dark pine pitch, gone hard as amber, was a single letter, the wax still whole, addressed in long, careful, old Palatinate German penmanship. To the granddaughter who returns. From Margaret Schaefer, Redware Potter, Schaefer's Lane, 1826. She broke the wax seal with her thumb and read the letter aloud to the barn, because there was no one else to read it to, and the slow, dim crocks in their dry, ash-pale glaze were the only thing listening. To the granddaughter who returns. If you are reading this, you have walked up Hammer Creek with a key in your hand, and you have brushed the snow and the leaves from the threshold, and you have stepped into the slow dim of the barn, and you have known to lift down a crock and scrape the ash slip back, and you are a Schaefer woman, and the kiln has called you home. My name is Margaret Schaefer. I came across the ocean with my husband Johann in the autumn of 1822, and I came up the Conestoga wagon road into the Lebanon Valley that winter, and I knelt at the bank of a small spring-fed branch on a cold February morning, and I pressed my thumb into a deep bank of red iron oxide clay, almost the color and feel of the clay my grandmother had pulled out of a bank above the Rhine for 50 years, and I knew that I would build my pottery here. The crocks on these shelves, granddaughter, are not the inheritance. The kiln book in this tin box is not the inheritance. The gold in the sack below is not the inheritance. The inheritance is the 87 small papers I have pressed under the ash-slip glaze of these unfinished crocks across the long winter evenings of my life, and my daughter's life, and her daughter's life, and her daughter's life, in the only place a lead-free redware recipe can be kept safe for 200 years, which is sealed inside the very clay it is meant to teach. Do not fire the crocks, granddaughter. Do not scrape the papers off in a hurry. Do not let any potter into this barn who would put lead in a glaze. Read the papers slow, one at a time, in the long winter evenings, and copy them by hand into a fresh book of your own making. And then, only then, when the recipes are in your hand in your own book, fire the crocks one at a time in the kiln in the order they were thrown, and let the slip-pressed paper become ash inside the clay where it belongs. The gold is the small grease that keeps the inheritance lit. The kiln book is the proof the past was real. But the papers under the glaze are the only true inheritance a Schaefer woman has ever had to give, and they have been waiting under the chalk-pale slip in the cool, dry dark of this barn for whichever granddaughter walked back up Hammer Creek with a key in her hand. With my whole hand and my whole heart, Margaret Schaefer, redware potter, Schaefer's Lane, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the 14th of October, 1826. Hannelore laid the letter flat on the small pine throwing table. She set her open palm across it. She did not cry. She closed her eyes and breathed in the cool, dry, red clay and ash smell of the pottery barn, and the faint, sharp ghost of 200 years of careful winter firings, and the tight thing that had lived in her chest since the cold November morning she had walked into her mammy's kitchen, loosened. The name of the loosening was home. She drove the gold pieces down to a careful coin dealer in Lancaster the following week, a man named Mr. Bertram Voorhees, who valued the 19 small $5 gold pieces at $42,800. She sold 6 of them. She put $14,000 in a savings account at the Lancaster County Bank, and she walked back up Hammer Creek with a sheet of new dark-stained pine board for the worst sill of the barn, a small bundle of hand-formed bricks for the cracked crown of the kiln, a coil of new oakum, a small bundle of fresh hardwood cordwood for the spring firing, and a small new bottle of kerosene for Mommy's lantern. She did not move the crocks. The crocks stayed on the cedar drying shelves where Margaret and Elizabetha and Anna and Hildegard had set them, in the slow dim of the barn, the papers still glazed safe under the chalk-pale ash slip. But she did, that 1st February, sit down at the small pine throwing table in the barn by the warm orange light of Mammy's kerosene lantern, with a fresh blank cotton paper book sewn together with linen thread and a small bottle of new walnut hull ink, and she began to copy the 87 small papers into a fresh book of her own making, one paper at a time, one slow February evening at a time. And in the early spring, when news that there was a Schaefer woman back at the pottery had walked up and down the Lebanon Valley the way news has walked up and down the valley since the first Conestoga wagon, the older Pennsylvania Dutch potters of 3 Lancaster County villages began to drive down the lane in their old farm trucks and stand quiet at the open door of the barn and not say much at all. One of them brought a small bundle of fresh hardwood cordwood for the spring firing and laid it beside the kiln. One of them, a man in his 80s named Mr. Obadiah Eberly from the Brickerville Pottery, who turned out to have apprenticed under Mommy's mother Anna in 1963, brought a small folded handwritten paper and laid it on the throwing table in the barn. On the paper was a list of every working redware pottery still firing in Lancaster County in the winter of 1964. Every name, every kiln, every potter, every fate. Schaefer's Lane was the only one still standing. We had begun to wonder, Mr. Eberly said very quietly, if the whole lead-free Pennsylvania Dutch glaze had finished forgetting. That is the thing about the redware potting our grandmothers teach us, the slow kind, the kind we learn at a kick wheel under a brass kerosene lantern when we are 3 years old. It is not really about the crock. The crock is the wage. The kiln is the trade. The trade is the lead-free ash slip glaze our great-great-great-grandmothers carried across the ocean from the Palatinate in 1822, and pressed under the chalk-pale slip of 87 unfinished Crocks across the long winter evenings of 4 lifetimes. The trade is, above all, the truth Margaret pressed into the clay itself on the 14th of October, 1826. The papers under the glaze are the only true inheritance a Schaefer woman has ever had to give. We are only the granddaughters who walk back up Hammer Creek with a key in our hand and lift down a crock and scrape the slip back and read the recipe slow. Hannelore Schaefer was 20 years old and evicted. She had $6 to her name, and she spent them on a collapsing redware pottery barn built into the south-facing slope of a stone-fenced field 2 miles up Hammer Creek Road in Schaefer's Lane in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. It was the best $6 she ever spent. If this story has kept you company tonight, thank you for sitting up with us. Sleep well, breathe easy, and see you in the last warm light of the day.